Okay, this is where shit gets real. And I know I have different page numbers from you, so I'm starting at the beginning of chapter 3 in volume 2. And it begins, the burst of transport was past. Ambrosio's lust was satisfied. Pleasure fled, and shame usurped her seat in his bosom. So he got what he wanted, and now he's feeling remorse. Who among us does not sympathize? On the next page, however, the paragraph begins as she spoke, and he says, Ambrosio again raged with desire. The die was thrown. His vows were already broken. The die was thrown. His vows were already broken. This is the downfall of Ambrosio. He decides that this one thing that he's done means he cannot recover. And we will sort of be tracing his descent now that he has decided that the die was thrown, which is, and we can talk about this in class, perhaps a use of free and direct discourse, but it's certainly his view, Ambrosio's, and maybe not the narrator's view, that all is over, the die is thrown. Okay, so then we get a very interesting gender switch again with Matilda, where she becomes too masculine for him, and he hates her masculinity and hates her for it. You don't need to follow the page numbers, but Matilda appeared the mildest and softest of her sex, devoted to his will, and looking up to him as to a superior being. Now she assumed a sort of courage and manliness in her manners and discourse that ill calculated to please him. She spoke no longer to insinuate, to command. He found himself unable to cope with her in argument and was unwillingly obliged to confess the superiority of her judgment. And then it goes on and on. He describes her as unfeminine. And so what's happened here, as you know, is that we get Rosario, who's a boy, who's utterly submissive. And then we get Rosario turn into Matilda, who's not only submissive, but virginal, sort of, except for the fact that she's taking off her clothes, who rescues him and then seduces him in this, and he is seduced. So they have sex. And then after that, he immediately starts liking her less. We might have some sympathy for that, or we might hate him for that. But in any event, when she starts to command him, he becomes much less interested in her sexually. In fact, what happens is that he uses her only to alleviate his libido, only to get off, and longs for some more feminine and virginal and innocent character, woman, Antonia, the same way he had sort of longed for Matilda. Okay, before that happens, he decides that it's no problem for him to commune with the devil. So all of the supernatural things that occurred in the narration of Raymond about his accidentally kidnapping the bleeding nun instead of helping Agnes to escape are made normal here, are normalized by the fact that there's supernatural things at work also in Ambrosio's life as well. So that now just becomes part of the world of the text. Okay. When he looks at Matilda, this is in still chapter 3, he hates her. He says, Matilda gluts me with he thinks, Matilda gluts me with enjoyment, even to loathing, forces me to her arms, apes the harlot, pretends to be a harlot, a whore, a prostitute, and glories in her prostitution. She is literally, to his mind, become a whore. Okay, disgusting. Did she know the inexpressible charm of modesty? Suddenly, modesty, we might read that as virtue, virginity, or ignorance, is the thing that's charming. How irresistibly it enthralls the heart of man. Man is enthralled by virtue, innocence, ignorance. How firmly it chains him to the throne of beauty. She, Matilda, would never have thrown it off. Okay, so what he's asking here is, what he's wishing here is that Matilda had remained virginal, right? Had remained virtuous, modest, shamed, abashed, suicidal, and that might have kept him going. But as she grows stronger, he's no longer interested because there's no violation. Okay, so then whom does he want to violate? Antonia. And Antonia, so he first goes to see her, leaves the monastery, which is shocking. And Elvira says to Antonia, his fine and full-toned voice struck me particularly, but surely, Antonia, I have heard it before. It seemed perfectly familiar to me. Either I have known the abbot in former times, or his voice bears a wonderful resemblance to that of some other. And Antonia replies, well, you can't have known him because he fell from heaven. And then we think, who else fell from heaven? Okay, in the battle over, in the original battle, Satan, or Lucifer, was an angel fallen from heaven, fallen from grace. And Ambrosio now has become that as well. Okay. One of the things that's so beautiful in this book is that Matilda is able to persuade Ambrosio with all of her reason and logic in these ways that are what we, characters in the book, would call sophistical sophistry. And yet Ambrosio's attempts to do the same thing to Antonia fail. This is the beginning of chapter 4. But the excellent morals which she owned to Elvira's care, the solidity and correctness of her understanding, and a strong sense of what was right implanted in her heart by nature, made her feel that his precepts must be faulty. By a few simple words, she frequently overthrew the whole bulk of his sophistical arguments and made him conscious how weak they were when opposed to virtue and truth. So she's now outwitting him just by virtue of her virtue, and virtue and truth are aligned here. That whatever is happening with Matilda is not virtuous, and thus we might say not truthful, that there's something else at stake. Satan, for example, the devil. Whereas Antonia, because she's so virtuous, is able to speak the truth. However, just a couple pages in, we get his reflection on Antonia reading the Bible. He says, Antonia reads the Bible and is still so ignorant, which means, of course, that the Bible talks about there's so much sex in the Bible, and how could Antonia be so ignorant if she actually had read all of these things, right? And then we get this brilliant moment where the narrator says, but upon a further inspection, he, Ambrosio, found that Elvira had made exactly the same remark. That prudent mother, while she admired the beauties of the sacred writings, was convinced that unrestricted, no reading more improper than the Bible could be permitted a young woman. And Antonia is reading an expurgated version, which means on the next page, all improper passages either altered or omitted. That even the Bible is too lascivious to give to a woman whose virtue, I would argue, lies entirely in her innocence. And that if you told her these things, she would be, and this is made explicit elsewhere, shocked that she has no idea that sex happens or even what that would mean. She doesn't know the difference between boys and girls, right? We remember. Okay, so another couple of pages in, ignorance and innocence are linked, and I want to again invite us to see Antonia and Agnes as foils for each other. Antonia is so innocent that it's proving difficult. One, she's so innocent that she's accidentally virtuous and able to fend off the monks' sophistry. But two, she's so innocent that she doesn't know how to protect herself. She doesn't know, unlike her mother, Elvira, that the monk actually poses some danger. So virtue in Antonia's case is linked to ignorance and innocence. Whereas in Agnes's story, we know she's not innocent or ignorant, and we wonder, assume that she maybe died for her sins, died for the knowledge, the tree of knowledge, right? She has eaten from the tree of knowledge. Okay, a couple more things a little later on. So Ambrosio visits the devil, as one does, and when he's down in the caverns, which run beneath and between the monastery and the convent, he hears these moans. And this is in chapter 4 as well. He hears these groans, and at that moment, an idea which flashed into his mind almost petrified him with horror. He started and shuddered at himself. Should it be possible? He groaned involuntarily. Should it but be possible? Oh, what a monster am I. So we're not explicitly invited to think of Agnes here, but I'm telling you that that would be a reasonable assumption, and that he thinks, rightly so, that the die is cast for him and he's going down to meet this supernatural being. And yet here's this woman whom he condemned for much, much less. Okay, so he at least is thinking of Agnes. Okay, one more thing, and this is in volume 3. Right at the end of chapter 1, he kills Elvira. And her murder is the moment at which we might say two things. One is that he then fails to rape Antonia because he's so appalled. So that's better than raping her, I guess, but also really bad. And he's now not just given in to temptation. Let me start the sentence over. So Agnes said to him at the very beginning of the novel, one day you're going to face temptation. And the fact that you have led a virtuous life because you've never been tempted doesn't make you virtuous. It just renders you untested. Here, he's finally exposed to temptation, and hilariously, temptation effected via a magical mirror that lets him see Antonia her breast being nibbled by a bird. Leaving that aside, he's now drawn to murder her mother in this way that shows us what he's descended to. And I won't read it to you, but there's a part earlier on in this section that says, had he been raised in the world, learned to face temptation and resist it, he would have been a great guy. And this might be another condemnation of the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, which requires celibacy, but maybe only also just requires seclusion from the world, so that innocence or ignorance is not sufficient for proving virtue or even teaching in sermons how to be virtuous, but that facing temptation and yielding it and then to it, and then as Agnes did, refusing further temptation is actually a much stronger position. This might be a way in which the novel is making Ambrosio the whore, murderous whore, and also making whores like Agnes extremely sympathetic to us. Okay, I'm going to stop talking and I'll see you in class.